Peter van der Walt. I see he is in. He and I will be co-hosting together with Ian this morning. Lovely to see you, Peter. Very relieved to see you.
I'm in, Peter. Good morning.
Morning. How are you? How are you keeping?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you.
Good. So good.
Sorry, Peter, we also welcomed our Dean. He joined in the meantime.
Oh. Yes, welcome, Reggie. So glad you could be with us. Welcome.
Good morning, colleagues. Good to join, and thank you for this wonderful conference. I will be in and out, but I'm here now. Wonderful. Thank you, Peter and Keith and the team.
Always. So appreciate you being here, Reggie. Thank you so much. Right, friends, it's 9 a.m. We are going to start. I'm sure others will join as we go, but we are going to start. Let me say an official welcome on behalf of Ecclesia. Ecclesia is the centre at the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch that deals with really ongoing education, ongoing theological education in an ecumenical context. And this is my first event, I think, at Ecclesia since I took over as director in August last year. Some of you will remember Connie Berger was the first director of Ecclesia, and then Bruce Theron took over from Connie, and then as of August last year, I came in as director. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to host this webinar today, which is based on a book written by various members of the Department of Practical Theology and Missiology at the faculty, and we have some of those authors with us, and they will be commenting on their the work that they've done by way of videos. The request is when the videos are playing, please mute your microphones. We will have a little time for interaction afterwards, but while the video is playing, please would you mute your microphone. We'll watch the various videos, and then there'll be a time for interaction at the end. Our time limits are quite tight today. We want to start, we've started at 9, we want to finish at 2, and we don't want to keep you beyond that. So we won't be having much time for discussion. The discussion will simply be 5 minutes at the end of each session before we move on to the next one. And the idea around the discussion and the videos is not to thrash out the topic in full, but to tease out the subject, for us to look at the effects of this pandemic on us as churches, and what we may have learned and what we still need to engage with as we learn to live with this pandemic. We probably won't be in a post-pandemic world for quite a while, and so we're going to have to learn the lessons and remember those lessons. We want to learn and remember. So that's partly what today is about. Again, as I said earlier, thanks to Simba. Simba will be monitoring the chat. So if you'd like to raise a question, just please put it in the chat or raise your hand. We won't be able to deal with all the questions because our time limits are quite tight, as I said. So, but I am hoping, we are hoping that this will engage you in further thought and further discussion. And I'm sure I'll hand over to Ian in a minute, but I'm sure you could engage with some of the staff who've written chapters in this book, and they would be able to give you some of their insights if you're interested in pursuing this further. My co-host today will be Peter van der Walt. Peter wrote the epilogue to the book that today's webinar is based on, and it was Peter who identified the 4 areas that we will use for the 4 sessions today. The pandemic as magnifying glass and accelerator, the pandemic and its effect on worship and connection, the pandemic and our participation in networks, and what the pandemic has said to us in terms of spirituality, theology and deep work. So Peter, warm welcome to you, and thank you also for your work on this. It's been immensely helpful. And Peter and I will be dealing with the introducing the sessions. So great to have you, Peter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Peter. It's a privilege.
I want to hand over now to Ian Null, just to for Ian to do a welcome on behalf of the department, and maybe say a little bit about how this book came to be before we launch into our first session.
Thank you.
Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this nice introduction. On behalf of the discipline group of Practical Theology and Missiology, I also want to welcome each of the participants and also everybody that is part of this webinar. I hope it will be a very interesting experience. It's the first of this kind for us in the discipline group. So welcome also to my co-authors, my colleagues who will be participating later. As Peter already indicated, I think it's an interesting program organized around the 4 themes that Peter summarized in his chapter. I'm not going to repeat that, but I think it's a very interesting way to conduct this webinar. The project started almost exactly 2 years ago. We were 3 weeks into the pandemic, and I woke up one morning and realized, as a practical theologian, the pandemic offer many opportunities to do research. So immediately I wrote a proposal. During those early days, we were in the position that we could get ethical clearance very quickly from the university to do research on the pandemic. So I was in the fortunate position that within 2 or 3 weeks, I got ethical clearance, and I started by interviewing the ministers from the Dutch Reformed and URCSA of the Stellenbosch circuit. That were about 20 ministers. And I asked them different questions about their own spirituality, about preaching and liturgy, about the way they organize the congregation, about koinonia, etc. And as I gathered the data, you can imagine it was half-an-hour interviews, and the data I got was an enormous lot of data. I realized I won't be in the position to analyze all of this on my own. So I thought, well, it might be a good thing to ask my colleagues to participate in the project. And I was very fortunate that apart from 2 colleagues who were on sabbatical, all of the other colleagues, including our dean, Professor Reginald, participated in this project. And it started out with initial thoughts. At the end, each one has got its own perspective from his own discipline on the pandemic, and it developed into a book with, I think it's 12 chapters. I just want to make sure, 12 chapters written from different perspectives in practical theology. And I think at the end covering the whole discipline of practical theology. So this is the result, the book that we will be discussing. And I want to start, say thank you to Dr. Peter Langeman, who came up with the idea with the theme of the conference as well, of the webinar. Peter, who joined in. And then I also want to thank Divine Robertson for helping with the logistics, and also Simba Pondani, who will be helping us with the videos, everything. So welcome. Thank you for organizing it, Peter. I'm really looking forward, and we hope you will all enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you for that background, and thank you for mentioning Divine as well, who does so much work for us. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand over now to Peter van der Walt, who's going to introduce the first session, which is the pandemic as magnifying glass and accelerator. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we are really in all of us in some ways trying to make sense of what has happened and what is happening with us. Because of the pandemic, we are all in a sort of a sense-making mode. We want to know what the lasting impact will be. We have some ideas of what has happened and so forth, but I just realized that we need more and more discussions about this, and we learn from each other. It's also a challenge for us to change, to get transformation in the good sense of the word. And it is really wonderful, I think, to start with the idea of the pandemic as a magnifying glass or as an accelerator. It came through all the chapters that all the participants in the book wrote, that this is a time of realizing that these things that we see now and that was exposed during COVID, they are not new things, but they were really exposed and magnified in a sense. If we start with Chantal now, Chantal Weber, who wrote about the children, I think that's a very good place to start. Now with the Ukrainian crisis, the Russian invasion, it is just significant to see how many times when interviews are done with people in the cities of Ukraine, the interviewer will ask the person, do you have children? And then the person will say, yes, 2 or 3 or whatever. And then the interviewer will ask, how old are they? And what are the impact? What do you see? It's sort of the first thing that comes to you is the children. And Chantal wrote about the children, and she said, she wrote that the thing is that in the past, theologians really did a lot to communicate the faith to children, but now it's different, and there's a void, there's a lack of our theology of children, yeah. So maybe Chantal, if we can start with you. I don't know if you can come in just for a minute or two before we watch the video. You said you talked about the fear in communities, the fear during COVID that is communicated, that is internalized by us, and especially by the children. And if fear itself is the defining cultural mood in a society, that is really a problem. Fear is institutionalized, you said. Maybe that's a very significant place for us to start this webinar today, Chantal.
Chantal, just before you speak, can we just ask Tommy to switch off his camera? Please, Tommy. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Sorry, I'm late. I'll do it now. Switch off the camera.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So, yeah, I think in terms of fear of the unknown, fear of loss of control, fear of loss of income, and also fear of what church means. I think that one's most relevant to this conversation. That was the overriding one. And I think amidst all of this, we'll see from the video, we forgot about the fear that children experience through the transfer of such fears in our lack of preparing for them. So I hope that's at least some introduction.
Thank you, Chantal. It's lovely to read your chapter. It's enriching. Let us look at the video, and then we'll have a few minutes just for discussion. We are talking to Dr. Chantal Weber, who is also a colleague at Practical Theology and Missiology. And she wrote a wonderful article for the volume on children in the congregation, especially during the time of COVID. Chantal, thank you for your time. Thank you. It's very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
May I ask, why did you choose to write this chapter, you know, about children in the congregation during time of COVID?
Yeah, well, firstly, I mean, I think before COVID, I felt that children's voices and agency within local congregations were already quite silent and marginalized. And so I was quite curious around what place children have taken up during this time. I mean, I think during the panic of just trying to sift through ministry in the new normal, initially with the hard lockdown, I was quite curious amidst all the just trying to rejuggle when church happens, how church happens. I was wondering what's happening with regards to children in those spaces, you know, and so that's where the curiosity kind of started, you know, if we're really struggling to think through how to cater for adults, how does that look for children during this time? So that's really where it started, at the back of, you know, my concern that prior to COVID, this was already an issue, that the child's voice and agency in our faith communities is rather silent.
So it is quite apparent that for a lot of these chapters, for a lot of these research projects, it already started before COVID, but it is as if COVID was like this magnifying glass or accelerator that focused our attention more on this. Where you could see that the problem was becoming clearer and so on. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about what you found? What did you see during the first phases of COVID regarding children in congregations?
Yeah, well, we hosted a few workshops and webinars with those involved with children's ministry, but eventually just reached out in terms of, you know, those children's ministry leaders or those overseeing children's ministry in different contexts. So just through a WhatsApp, you know, how's it going? What support do you need? What are some of the things you're thinking through? And so that was kind of the main platforms, the webinar and also the WhatsApp groups, you know, just to see what's happening within your church space. Do you have anything active happening with regards to children, and in what format? And it was very interesting. The very first response around online activity was, you know, pulling things from the internet and making these packages up to send to families as resource. So many churches seem to have set up resource packages for children. And what was also very interesting for me there, which is a different discussion for another paper as well, would be that many people just pulled, you know, coloring in or Bible story kind of resources from the internet and then put that together for them. And so I think the curious thing for me there is that many of them were either UK or American based, not very localized resources. But because of the time, people just felt they needed to put these packages together for families. So that was an overarching, that's what was put together. Some children's ministry leaders put together some video clips for children, which they sent through different online platforms, mainly WhatsApp platforms to the families, just a greeting from the Sunday school leader maybe, or the children's ministry worker, greeting the kids. And then they would also send like clips, YouTube clips of songs that children could do. But most of the agency rested with the parent, you know, that the parent would have tools to be able to have some form of devotional worship time with their kids. Very few congregations, but some did within the poorer communities. They actually didn't have anything going for Sunday mornings in terms of formal children's ministry. But what they did do was try and help parents in terms of education. So, you know, schools were also affected. And so access to schools were affected. And then, of course, if you didn't have internet, online schooling wasn't an option. And so you found in those communities, the children's ministry teams would set up resource packs on math or English. Same thing, printed from the internet and just sent, to parents so that their children could at least have some form of curricular activity. But then in 2 communities, it was very exciting to see that food drives were happening. So the children's ministry team and the volunteers there, instead of having your Bible story, they opted to kind of serve the community by doing food parcels and creating food packs for families in need at the time. And so that was their way of ministering to families, not just the children. So those were the 3 core kind of approaches to children's ministry. And unfortunately, the fourth core was that churches just didn't have capacity to think about the children. And so they encouraged parents to really think about how they can engage with their children. So nothing then happened within some of those contexts.
Chantel, you do a lot to make us aware of the marginalization of children, also in congregations, especially in congregations, and that theologically and ecclesiologically speaking, they are part of the congregation. Could you perhaps, just in short, in conclusion, tell us what you see from here, the way forward? What can congregations do to change that?
Yeah. So the beginning of the chapter, before I share the findings, really gives a theological background as to how early church fathers and early theologians actually prioritized children in our theology, and many theological writings on the place and position of the child in the history of theology. The change happened when we started offering formalized academic theology within academic institutions. And so one of the things I see being a gap is that there isn't a priority of children's ministry training within local congregations. So we'll have leadership development training for different spheres. And so the encouragement for me would be to really tap into the rich history of theological tradition, aligned to your own faith tradition. There's enough resource for different traditions today, and really just equip the children's ministry workers in your sphere, whether they're paid or part-time or volunteers, whether they are the mamas or the grannies, really just get them motivated that what you are doing is biblically mandated. It's really something that you should see as a calling of God on your life. So that would be the first thing. I think once those in local congregations get that, they just realize that they're partnering with God as they connect with these children in different ways. So that would be my first recommendation to local communities. The second would be, of course, to really then ecclesiologically embrace the children's ministry as the church. And that I mean by resource development, I mean by planning, really incorporating that as part of church. I mean, it's October now, so it's time to set the calendars in motion for next year. It's time to set the budgets in motions for next year. And so the question would be, have you considered what that looks like for the children's ministry in your context? Most times it's not. And so just the call to really make sure that if we say the children are the church, are we planning for them the way we plan for adults within our context?
The children are the church. Chantel, thank you so much for your contribution. It deepens our discussion, and we look forward to the discussion in the conference as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Chantel, thank you once again. It feels like you are talking to us right now. Yes, as you said, the early theologians emphasized the importance of children within the home, the church, and society as an integral part of how we live theology. You concluded now by suggesting how we can address that. But maybe there's a question or two for Chantel. You are welcome to have a comment or a question. We have a few minutes.
Can I ask Chantal a question? It's been research done in the previous year already, 2020, beginning of 2021. We already in 2022. Did some of the things change in the meantime? Did you come upon new insights in the meantime that you want to fill in with what you wrote? Just a question concerning things are changing so rapidly, maybe new insights.
Yeah, thanks so much, colleague. In fact, so another study we also did was a global one. So this one was specifically on South Africa and congregations here. And then I engaged as South African with colleagues from Norway, from the Netherlands, and from the UK. I think one other thing to add to this voice here was the lack of pastoral care training when it comes to children. And so that we do not wait for times of crisis to equip children's ministry leaders with pastoral care skills. And so that was another one that was highlighted in that global study of which I took part as well. I have actually started teaching children's ministry now this semester, and I tested this. My very first lecture was on the impact of COVID on children's ministry. And in the class there of at least 20 different denominations, unfortunately, it's confirmed that still churches haven't kicked in terms of active children's ministries. I think churches are still figuring out how to come back to face-to-face ministry. And sadly, most of the students, besides 2, reported that still in their local church context now in 2022, the children's ministries haven't opened yet in any form. The 2 who did respond were those who have been online throughout. And one of the things that the study also proved was, technology fatigue, online fatigue. So kids would start with the fun and games on the video that was made, and then they'll go play somewhere else. So these students in my class right now were confirming that's the case. And then another student confirmed what we discovered in this chapter, the church's role in outreach. And so there's a student whose church is currently a house church and is engaging with children through feeding them at the moment. And just trying to do after school, tutoring. So they don't have the formal children's ministry program at their local Sunday morning service because they're still figuring it out, but they are in the week, 5 days a week, feeding kids in the Clutersville community there, and also doing some tutor programs. So the form of how we engage with children has changed in this context. But sadly, in my fuller class of 28 students, about 20 congregations there, it seems like we're still trying to figure out how to come back as church.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. I see here a comment. With the pandemic affecting the tithes of congregations and offerings of many local congregations, how has this reality impacted on the inequality in resource-strained congregations with regards to budgets? So this question is about the financial reality of congregations and the inequality that we have, and some suffering more than others. Maybe this is not exactly in your field, Chantal. If you want to respond, you are welcome. But we also see this magnified during COVID as a reality, and that also impact on congregations.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely think it's a broader question for the whole webinar today. Yeah. But one of the telling things about children's ministry being neglected is the fact that they don't pay tithes. I think that is part of the priorities. Those who are paying the monies get prioritized. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you so much. Chantal, thank you for your participation. Thank you for the chapter. I think we, as Peter said, our time schedule is very tight, actually too tight, but the whole idea is that we have these kind of teasers for us to discern further and put everything that we can on the table this morning. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Peter, I'm just checking with you. We are now moving on to our next video, the interview with Reverend Nobuntu.
That's the one, Peter. Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks once again, Chantel. And now the video, the interview with the Reverend Nobuntu Penta Matuleni. She's at the moment busy writing a thesis. I've seen her last week. I'm not sure if you are here this morning, Nobuntu, but I know that she's currently busy writing a thesis. Let us then jump directly into the video interview. She wrote on a very, very thought-provoking article. It was very interesting to me, and a fascinating discussion with her on the experience when there was bereavement and death in her own community during COVID, when people couldn't go to the funerals in person. Let us watch that video and then have a discussion.
Reverend Nobuntu Penta Matuleni did a wonderful study on death and the home during COVID. She reflected on her own experience using a narrative approach in research, and wonderful to read. It's wonderful to have you here, Nobuntu.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me here.
I want to ask you, maybe firstly, what motivated you? What drove you to write this specific article? I got the sense it was very personal for you.
Yes, it was. Other than Jan wanted the chapters, I actually wanted to reflect on because COVID-19 made me reflect on the HIV times and sort of compare which one was worse, because during HIV, one would think that that was worse. And now looking at death in particular, because at the beginning, HIV people were dying. But what's different with COVID is that it's in isolation. The death is happening in isolation. So I wanted to reflect on that and how much we lost, not just the particular individual or member of the family, but everything that makes who we are. It went together. So it was not one get to reflect on that after the funeral, that I actually didn't lose that. Which one was painful? Was the loss of my niece in my case, or was the loss of not being me? Because that defines Amakhosa. That's where you see Amakhosa is during the birth, is during the death, and the wedding. That's where you see this is different. Or these are Amakhosa. Those are the times that you see, and that was lost. And I don't think one realizes until you actually look at it.
So one could really sense when reading your narrative that there was a deep sense of loss. The digital world couldn't compensate for this, and you also had the description of the role of the umbilical cord. Will you maybe say something about that?
Yeah, it is called Inkaba, and that's why the black people with the land, it's not just the piece of land to have a roof over your head. It's way more. It's associated with many things. The birth of the child is in that land. The umbilical cord is buried around the yard, depending on the clan. And that is where that child would talk about him or herself very proudly in the places like Gauteng and the Western Cape, saying, Ingaba yami lele. At this particular place, that means my umbilical cord is sleeping in that particular place. So that's where you are drawn to. That's where you belong. That's where your home is. That's where, so you want to reconnect with that when you go home alive. One reconnect with that when one dies. And that's why people don't understand and people judge and people say, what is this thing of the whole of money? I remember the colleague that I was working with, the pastor who didn't understand why, was helping his employer, but didn't understand why do you have to give the money, the whole lot of money to go there, instead of just doing here. If he doesn't have money, instead of just doing here, is way more than just burying somebody under the ground. It's way more. There is a reconnection that need to happen, and one reconnects with that. And those rituals that are happening there, we bring you to that. And the fact that you come and sleep at home, and then the next day you're being buried, you're being reconnected with that. If I'm gonna take that further, because there's another article that I wrote for Johan Silier's farewell book, where I unpack Fukwini, where the place of death. So the place of death is there as well. That's where the child is buried. I mean, the child is born in that particular space, and the body comes and stay in that particular place at night. And then to the grave side the next day. So there is that reconnection. So you ask me why. When I'm reading it, Peter, as well, I realized that I'm actually now putting a mirror to Amaxhosa as well, because you don't think about you. Do you think about you? You don't think about you because you just do, Peter. Yeah. So I think Amaxhosa as well, we just do that. We don't reflect. You don't reflect on you. And so I was putting a mirror. This is you. When somebody says nobody works like this, I'm like, do I work like that? Because I don't think. So in a way, one of the reasons is to put a mirror to Amaxhosa. Look, this is who, this is you. Did you even think of that when you're going back? You're going back to that place where you were born. You're going to be sleeping in the place where you were sleeping when you were born. Exactly in that space, in the people that have that home, because there is this movement. But there's a certain place and certain home where the mother of the child stay with the child, and that is the place where the coffin is put when one is died. So that's deeper.
It's so fascinating, the thing that you say about self-reflection. You don't think about doing Peter or doing Ubuntu or doing the Christian Ubuntu, the Christian Peter.
You just be.
You just be. Ubuntu, there was also a reflection in this volume about what is called digital mourning, or mourning in the digital space, mourning over a loved one in digital spaces. What is your thoughts about that?
What I did in the article, I actually show that this is what is happening normally. This is what is not happening because of COVID-19. Normally, the mourning, the grieving, the healing, it takes place simultaneously as soon as the death announced. There is a loss, there is a pain, there is everything that is happening there, because I'm saying that because as soon as the people are being told, then the people are putting you, the one who lost, or the family, in the space of beginning to grieve or mourn. And that doesn't happen in isolation. That doesn't happen individually. That is happening collectively. And that is what we missed. And remember, I'm reflecting on the townships of Cape Town, where there is no digital. Even if it was there, the mourning, the grieving of Amaxhosa is communal, is collective. That is where everything is begin, and that is where the family is allowed to sit there in that space, to sit in that space and being given a space, to sit in the space and being given a space to mourn and grieve, but collectively. It's given a space in the space, but not alone. That is happening with the people around. That is happening with singing. That is happening with people that are coming. That is happening in people that are reflecting in the life of the deceased. Now, when that is happening during COVID-19, the people were allowed. There is a space that I talked about there, Peter, in the chapter, the space that the mourner, that one person that sits next to the coffin, there is a space there, there is a mat there that she sits in. And that mat is symbolic and is part of grieving and mourning and healing. Sits there, but during the COVID-19, there is no space, because that space becomes space when there are people. So because of separation of how many people, one does that alone and one that doesn't do it, because that is not something that you can do it alone. That is not something you can do it alone. There is a loss. At the beginning of this, we talked about the loss, the double loss. So there is the loss of that, because that space is not a space without the space given to you by the community. So what I did is to borrow at Sirier's words of the fourth space towards the end of the article. The fourth space, he is calling that emerging space. And I call that misplaced, displaced. In the article that I referred to, that was written for the farewell of Johan Sirier, I proposed for pastoral care the paradigm ukuzimasa, that means be. And that paradigm, Peter, when we come to what you ask, that paradigm couldn't work, but it's because it still works with people. So I use the word misplaced, because what COVID-19 did, that is now my finding, if I'm not jumping. What that COVID-19 did, it called for people to go deeper, to meet in a place that they wouldn't voluntarily meet. And that's why I'm calling that it is misplaced, because it's not where it's supposed to be. And we're going to this space, not voluntarily. We're going to this space because the space, we are misplaced, and it calls now to go deeper. It calls to come to you, because that place, Amaxhosa, you go to the space to give the space to the mourners. But now you're going in, you're going deeper. And Johan says, if I'm not mistaken, that's faith. And you only access that space. And the article says, if that is the space that you can access very easily, that is the space that is very difficult to access. It's easy to access, it's difficult to access. It depends on how deep you want to go. So we can meet still in Cape Town, Cape Town, my sister's in Joburg, the other one is there on that space. That going deeper, that now seeing with the spiritual eyes. Now is the other way. So I'm stretching that paradigm that I proposed in that article, that ukuzimasa, now we're stretching that beyond the physical space, not even digital, but within. And that is the place where one meets God. And that is the place now COVID-19, in my opinion, called us to be, to meet each other. I don't see you, but I can feel you in that misplaced space.
Ubuntu, thank you for your chapter. You really help to enrich the whole discussion and deepen the discussion. We're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Ubuntu explained her sense of deep loss during COVID. The digital space couldn't do it for her and her community during a time of bereavement and loss and burial. So that was really, really a deep loss. There are other chapters in the book where people argued that the digital space creates a wonderful opportunity for being together, for creating community, for different things, also for liturgy and so forth. Maybe that will also come to the fore when we get to the interviews with Cas Weppener and Nicolas Mathieu. Then we will, I think these different perspectives will come into discussion with each other. Are there any, well, Ubuntu can't be here this morning, but so we cannot ask her questions, but any comments, any discussion on this wonderful input by Ubuntu? I see a hand. Yehudia, I see your hand.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed the discussion very much, and it was deeply interesting to me, especially working with hybrid students who are mostly amaXhosa. And it was so interesting because now I'm thinking from their platform on at the university, coming into a setting that is so much constituted by Western culture. The academic system is really constituted by Western culture and very rationally orientated. That does not necessarily make provision for students who mourn and sometimes have to travel hundreds of kilometers, sometimes during tests, sometimes during classes. And knowing now that healing and that bereavement, mourning and healing coincide means that it is so important for these students, therefore, to go to burial sites and be within that space in order for them to also attain their own healing. And for me, it's something that we who are trying to create a space already by so many Xhosa students that are at the university. I think we should really reconstitute the lens of how do we do academics or how do we constitute the academic system that is rooted within the African context. So it is just a comment that I really find that thing very interesting and food for thought. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yehudia. Eerwaarde Lujabi, I also see your hand.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to concur and in a way to ride on from what the previous speaker was all saying. It was deep. It was a deep conversation. I enjoyed, and thank you to Reverend Ubuntu. So the perspective I just wanted to bring to concur with her is because I was one of the clerics. I took a lot of funerals in the Gugulethu township particularly. And you know what she says, I can almost connect with the pain that is associated with it, not just her own grief, but just the grief upon grief that was brought about by what she's speaking, the misplacement of being Xhosa and African and how it is usually understood. Now, especially when it was a COVID funeral, it was very difficult for the people. You could see that there is no sense of connection with the funeral itself. And that was the most painful thing that one could experience. And it was most painful to minister in that kind of environment. And you could find that grief is more intense now, not because of the actual death and the misunderstanding of the COVID concept. That on its own was weighty, but then the fact that people now need to disorientate or reorientate themselves to the disorientation that has been caused by the pandemic to a society and the humanity. So I understand, and I want to concur that as we journey on, possibly in this pandemic, even towards the end, the lessons about who we are, as the previous speaker said, need to go deep so that we really understand one another, even while we are connected academically, but the persons that are connected, really, there's something far deeper to who we are. So thank you very much to Reverend Ubuntu, and I feel what she was saying. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It is not only interesting academic work that we are busy with here, but really about our deepest being. And you talk about pain, the experience of pain, grief upon grief. I think Chantel in the beginning also said that part of our trauma is not only with the things that we are talking about out there, but also about the role of the church, the role of pastoral work, the role of church leaders, of congregations. What will our role be? And as you say, it is a wonderful opportunity to go deeper. I'm looking forward also to the chapter of our Dean. Professor Nell also wrote about deep work that we could see during COVID. We need to go deep, and thank you so much for that. Are there any other comments or questions before we move on to the last part of this session?
Peter, I see there's a question.
There's a question. Is that in the in the comments? Oh yes, I see it here. In African setting, we mourn by being helpful to one another during that space. Ubuntu, can you please tell more on the neglect of cultural and spiritual rituals, such as slaughtering the cow when the head of the family died? So that is being helpful to one another during that space. Could you tell more on the neglect that was during COVID of cultural and spiritual rituals? You couldn't do the rituals. Unfortunately, Ubuntu can't be here, but maybe somebody else that wants to comment on this.
Maybe I can also again just come in there, because those things were indeed missing. For instance, in my own family, my grandmother died, my wife's grandmother, and she was the person, the head of the home, surviving. So one of the things that happened is that all those things were also taken away by the pandemic season. And what you find now, for instance, recently when we've gone to level 1 and all, there was a real huge growth in the way in which people were sort of on a marathon to do those kinds of things that were not done during that period, as a way of sort of catching up with the things that needed to happen. So definitely all those things were affected by the season.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I also see here Dr. Peter White wrote an article, Restriction of Burial Rights During the COVID-19 Pandemic, an African Liturgical and Missional Challenge. That was in the HTS Theological Studies, and he has put the link in there. Thank you so much, Dr. White. Thank you. Good. Let us move on to our last part now of this first session, and let us immediately go to the interview with Professor Bowers de Tooy, Nadine Bowers de Tooy, and then Nadine, if you want to come in after that to maybe say a thing or two more. That was also recorded a few months earlier. So maybe in the meantime, you want to add something. You and Deborah, who co-wrote the article with you, are very welcome. Let us move to that video.
Our next discussion is with Professor Nadine Bowers de Tooy, who is also a lecturer at Practical Theology and Missiology. And it's very nice to talk to you this morning, Nadine.
Yeah, you too, Peter. Looking forward to the conversation.
Nadine, you wrote this article together with Deborah Hancock, who did a PhD study with you also within this theme. And yeah, it's wonderful to read and thought-provoking, especially during the time of COVID, when you wrote it, the first stages of COVID. There was this move in congregations towards joining networks, participating in networks because of the great need in the communities. What did you see? What motivated you, the two of you, to write this article?
Yeah, Peter. So firstly, seeing initially how churches started engaging, but first at the beginning, it was quite slow from the side of congregations and I think even national organizations. While we saw a lot of individual Christians starting to be activated, and very soon local congregations came on board. Now, that is how it's what local congregations do best. During a time of crisis, local congregations usually start engaging in relief actions, activating soup kitchens, etc., etc. And we saw a lot of exciting things going on. But one of the bodies or organizations which is always there in terms of social relief and development, in terms of addressing socio-economic distress, whether it's COVID or not, are the faith-based organizations. And here we're specifically talking about Christian non-profits. Because local congregations are also faith-based organizations. They also act in this space. And we were saying, well, it's interesting how faith-based organizations are operating in the space, congregations are operating in the space, and also watching how faith-based organizations were becoming frontline workers. They always are frontline workers, but more so during COVID, we use that term. And then also how they were becoming network points, if you will, for congregational actions. With the establishment of local economic networks, but local community action networks, things like that, the lean networks that sprang up, and so forth. So we specifically wanted to focus on the FBO. And what we realized with the FBO is that often they are not seen as a missional community or as part of what church is understood as. They're often seen as a para. We talk about para-church organizations alongside the local church. And so coming out of Deborah Hancock's research, PhD research on the FBO as a missional organization, we kind of wanted to challenge that and say, how do we challenge these dominant ecclesiologies? And also, how do we encourage local congregations and FPOs to work closer together, seeing each other both as part of joining in God's mission, the Missio Dei.
This is wonderful research that you did, and timely. I mean, it's going on. We can see it. We sense it within our communities. And you give us language to talk about this and to think it through. What were the most important thing that you think when we think of going forward? In the meantime, we've proceeded. COVID did not end. We are in wave 3. What do you see is happening, and what is necessary now to do? Raising awareness, learning new practices. What are the things that you see are necessary now?
I think the main thing that research has discovered, I mean, some of the research that I've done over the years has been focused on local congregations, and then some of my other research has been on these faith-based organizations, the non-profits. And what I saw a few years back with local congregations is that local congregations were activated during times of crisis. It's not that they weren't active, during other times, but they became heightened in terms of the response to poverty and inequality during a crisis, such as COVID, such as the xenophobic attacks that we saw, etc., etc. Fires, all of those kind of things. It activates local congregations to respond. And yet we've seen FPOs are consistently there, often supported by local congregations, also often founded out of local congregations, often consisting of volunteers that are Christians coming from local congregations. And yet, often after the crisis recedes, the kind of networking, interaction, and sustainability sort of dies out. And I think both Deborah and I, as we wrote this paper, we were very aware that there's an enormous opportunity for closer relationships and networking and understanding between local congregations and these faith-based organizations to really see each other and work together in God's mission, because both of them are working in the vineyard in different ways, perhaps, sometimes with different emphases, perhaps, but both within, God's mission. And so I think looking forward, our desire in writing this paper, and we've also, on Deborah's PhD research in particular, had some feedback sessions with congregations and with FPO leaders, congregational leaders, FPO leaders, saying we need to talk more about how FPOs and churches can, work together in a closer way.
Nadine, thank you so much. We are looking forward to the discussion about this in Ecclesia. We are all dealing with this. We are seeing this in our communities, experiencing it, and you are helping us on the way forward. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter. Really appreciate the time and enjoyed engaging. So please read it, and we'd love to hear more from everybody, what they think, how they understand it. And I know Deborah's also really open to engaging more on this particular issue, especially as she works within the FPO space, but has a real passion for seeing congregations activated in terms of development, care, advocacy, and relief. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, Nadine. Good morning.
Hey, Peter. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Morning from retreat, where I see the background is not looking too good here, but anyway.
Nadine, I immediately see a good question. Has there been any research on sustainability of these networks? My own experience was donor fatigue set in. What did you find?
Yeah, so I mean, there hasn't been any further research on it. So Stephen, maybe that's something to consider for a next round. What I am looking at now is the issue of food security and faith communities. And we know that the CANs and then also the LEANs, the local ecumenical action networks, that were set up during that time, we would hope that they would continue to operate. But the studies that have been done in the past by me, like I said, showed more that but shortly after the crisis abated, churches have done their bit and then they go back into the normal way of operating. And so it actually would be really interesting to study whether this was the case here, because I think the hope is that these leans would continue to be activated and that local congregations would find ways to continue to work together. And I think to dig into, in a deeper way, some of the issues, contextual issues in their own communities. Because we know, of course, hunger and food insecurity and unemployment and all those things are only fruits. They are roots. And often churches, we're good at addressing those things, the relief efforts, but dealing with the roots is a long journey. And I think that's where faith-based organizations can come together with local congregations, because faith-based organizations of the nonprofit type, or what Deborah calls the Christian Development Organization, has been working on the ground, often in a sophisticated way, dealing with the roots over a longer period of time. And so, I'm proposing it would be more, we're proposing rather, it would be more sustainable, if congregations and FBOs would work together in a closer way. So thanks for that question. I think that's the topic of another study. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Anything else? Maybe a question to Nadine, a comment? I know in our denomination there is a really a serious discussion going on. We want to see a move from charity to deeper reconciliation and justice, to to get away from the handout mentality, and to form new community. And how do you help congregations to do that, or where do we find? Maybe we should go and look, where do we find some of that, and learn from people where that happens. So really looking forward to that research as well. Any other questions or comments for Nadine? I see we are within our time limits, which is unusual. That's very nice. Sometimes you get you get behind.
It's true. Peter, while we're waiting, I think just on your comment around, working into the love, the peace, and the justice of God. I serve on the board of an organization called The Warehouse, which some of you may know, the Warehouse Trust. And that's part of the work that they do. So I think FBOs could also help local congregations, FBOs like the Warehouse, that specifically work with capacitating local congregations to work together, to understand, do social analysis, but also find each other in a community space. And, it's so difficult. Best practice is so difficult. There's wonderful things going on. But also, I think the key starting point there is openness, vulnerability, relationality. We have to address many of the challenges that were raised by the apartheid era that divided us. And so to find each other again, I think is one of the biggest challenges facing us as church in South Africa today, and which will enable us to move beyond this charity mindset, relational openness, and also understanding the nature of power, our histories, our divided history, but of course also the work and the message of the kingdom that shapes and forms all of us, and wants to see a new community birthed in the midst of all of this.
So in a sense, we need guidance with that. We need help with that. And there are people who can come in and do facilitation and guide your process.
Yes, for sure. So I'm plugging the Warehouse now as a board member. But also I'll post Deborah's thesis there on the chat if I can find it, and also There's another article written by another student of mine who also worked on, you know, the relationship between congregations and FBOs. Deborah and I have had some conversations with FBO leaders and also congregational leaders on these issues. And what came out of that was we want more of these conversations where we can actually sit around the table together, learn from each other as faith leaders, as missional leaders. And I think those are spaces which I'd also personally like to dig into and are happy to facilitate.
Wonderful. Nadine, thank you so much. I got a note here from Ian. Ian is just going to come in. Ian, I want to invite you to say a few words.
Yeah, well, in the first place, thank you very much for your contribution, Nadine. We really appreciate it because it's under very difficult circumstances. Her child got sick last night and she stayed specifically for this session. She's got to have her child at the Daniela, at the doctor at 11 o'clock. So we really appreciate that you participated. Thank you very much, Nadine.
Thanks, colleague.
From all of us, Nadine, thank you so much and all the best. We will pray for you this morning.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone.
I was thinking as we proceeded, we have these neat 4 sessions in the 4 themes, but there are a lot of connection between the different themes and the different pieces. And you will sense that they will all come into discussion with each other. And I hope as the morning progresses that we will find that this is helpful in our own discernment, in our own sense making, in our communities, in our faith communities and in our communities. But thank you so much for our first 3 participants. There was a lot of hard work that went into this, and it is wonderful to read through the chapters. I hope that you will get hold of a copy of the book and that you will find the time to read through it. It is really thought-provoking and challenging, and also practical. So Peter, back to you. We are on time. Thank you for that. And the next session will be yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to colleagues for your inputs, and a real thank you to Nadine. I'm not sure if she's still with us, but it's so difficult when our kids are need help and we have commitments. So thank you so much for staying with us and being here. We really appreciate that so much. I want to introduce the next session, which is about worship and connection. And I think Cas is here. Cas,
indeed,
around?
Morning, teacher. Yes.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Welcome, Cas.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Thank you for being here. You know, certainly, I think it's in this area of connection that COVID really impacted us as congregations were closed basically overnight. We had to, you know, learn how to do things as pastors and ministers, things for which we hadn't been trained. And now as we find things opening up, church attendance is not what it was. There's research out of the US that says many people who were churchgoers before might not come back to church. You know, so this whole area of connection within congregations is really a struggle for us, I think. But on the other hand, we now have some digital platforms. We've had to learn how to do that, perhaps, but we've established them now, and you know, for better or for worse, they probably will be part of our reality for a while. And so, you know, how do we establish connection in a digital space? You know, those are things that I think you've reflected on. And also the idea of the church as ecclesia, not necessarily people gathering in a physical space, but connecting with one another in other ways. and then also connection between congregations, and between churches and denominations and so on. So perhaps as we introduce this section on worship and connection, you could tell us something of what you experienced and what you have found and what you have discovered.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Johan Silje and I, we co-authored this chapter, and there are many approaches you can take to any phenomenon that you look at. And a lot of people globally was initially extremely negative about the possibility of worshipping online whatsoever. We took a different approach. We said we're in a huge crisis, and we think that attempts at keeping connections via worship and liturgy, that is absolutely critical for the church going forward. So all that we did was we tried to better understand certain aspects of worshiping online. And we focused on, for example, the body, on ritual dimensions, etc., etc. So hopefully the video can open up a discussion. I know this is a topic that so many worshippers and also ministers and leaders and music leaders are very interested in. And what the future holds, we don't know. But what I do know is we must think and talk about this at the moment.
I see a comment on the chat. Stephen says, thank you for this discussion and opportunity. The effect of COVID trauma building on previous trauma, sort of compounded trauma, which is with our people. Yes, agreed. Church must work closely together to help our people. Perhaps liturgy and aspects can help with this. In other words, I think what this is addressing is the kind of the ructions, the social ructions that have taken place in people's lives, and COVID as part of that, and the effect to which liturgy can help us to process that. Perhaps I think that's what the comment is getting to. Can you comment on that?
I can try. Yes, there's actually over the past decades been a lot of research on that. Recently, earlier this year, I actually gave a paper at our society on a comparable theme. For example, if you look at liturgy, you can also look at liturgy as a phenomenon from the perspective of cultural anthropology. Then liturgy is also a ritual conducted by humans, okay? And people, anthropologists like Victor Turner, they've written extensively on social dramas occurring in our societies, smaller disruptions, bigger disruptions, etc., etc., and the critical role of ritual within those social dramas. Now, when it comes to the pandemic, when we look at South Africa, we already had a lot of social dramas in this society of ours. From 94, smaller ones, tensions, we had Black Lives Matter, etc. On top of everything, we also had the pandemic. And within this, we get so many rituals and liturgies, from core Sunday morning rituals and liturgies to protest marches in the public square. They all make a huge contribution in this regard. So I can just confirm it can be very, very helpful. I mean, ritual and liturgy, they've got dimensions. They've got an ethical dimension, therapeutic, etc. But if we are not careful and very critical, rituals and liturgy can also be pathological, and they can do the opposite of what they should be doing. They can do the opposite of healing and taking us forward to a better place. So yes, thank you. It's a very good comment.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're going to move now to the video. So over to you, Simba. Thank you so much, Gus. We'll have a chance to get back to you afterwards too. Thank you so much.
Professor Kas Wettener, together with Johan Silje, wrote about lockdown liturgies. They did some research and did a lot of thinking and helping us with a question about liturgy during lockdown. Kas, what exactly did you write about?
Peter, the title was Lockdown Liturgy in a Network Culture. a richer liturgical exploration of embodiment and space. In other words, we focused on bodies in other spaces connected to liturgies. We specifically looked at lockdown liturgy, worship services under levels 4 and 5. In other words, when spatial restriction was completely serious, we weren't allowed to gather in congregations in church buildings. And we also looked specifically at the Dutch Reformed Church. So in the chapter, we did 4 different probes. From each probe, we gained some insight. And those insights that we gained, let's call them dots. In the end, we tried to connect the dots. That's basically it.
These are really burning questions at the moment, especially when we think about the future of congregations and liturgy. Could you tell us a bit more about the 4 probes?
Yes, certainly. The 4 probes, like I said, for every probe, we use the lenses of bodies in space or in different places, okay? The first one was what I call a descriptive exploration. In other words, just what's going on. The second one was more philosophical one. Then we also did an anthropological one, like cultural anthropology, a ritual one. And the fourth one was a theological one. So let me start with the first one. We first needed to just get a description of what's going on with regard to lockdown liturgies. To get a good grip, we focused on the Dutch Reformed Church. There's a platform on the internet called Kieskerk. So we used an excellent book by the ritual studies expert Ronald Grimes. It's called The Craft of Ritual Studies, okay? And he's got different categories. In other words, he gives you a tool with which you can then describe and afterwards analyze rituals such as Christian liturgies, okay? He's got a lot of those categories, but we just chose the ones related to humans with bodies and to spaces. Okay, so the first one we focused on was related to actions and actors. Okay, so you can think of the worshippers and the people leading the worship. So, and the actions that they do in those spaces. So we asked, compared to the typical Sunday physical gatherings, what were the actions? Which ones were kept, which ones were omitted, and why? So for us, that was quite significant. On the one hand, obviously, it's very practical. You've got a worship service. You cannot take everything onto an online worship service. On the other hand, it's theologically very significant, because why would you retain some elements, some actions, and why would you leave out others? There's a deep theology in that. I mean, in the Dutch Reformed Church, for example, it shows why would a minister choose to keep the sermon but not the sacrament. A bit of it is quite obvious, but if you probe a little bit deeper, you will see that inherent to it, there is a liturgical theology, and we try to unpack that and analyze that. The same is true with regard to ritual actions. What did people do? Usually in a Dutch Reformed worship service, as you know, we sit, we listen, and we look, and we watch. Okay, now that was even exacerbated in lockdown liturgies, because now we watch screens and we looked and listened even more. What about the other 3 senses? What about smelling, tasting, feeling? Okay, so on the one hand, just by observing this, we realized, we've got to a certain extent sensory anemic liturgies. Okay, and even more so during lockdown. And in the same breath, I must say, there were a couple of very creative liturgists in the Dutch Reformed Church who realized this and did quite a lot to also include the other senses. Then, of course, with regard to space, usually we're in a church building, in pews, etc., etc. But now, all of a sudden, we were in different spaces, maybe in bed, watching the computer, or in the living room, or in the TV room, or whichever space you had to do that. Now, what's important here is that that new space, that domestic space, was transformed. It still looks just like your bedroom, okay, with clothes lying around and a coffee mug, etc. But, and this is important, because of the fact that you're there streaming liturgy and not Netflix. Liturgy has got an inherent symbolic potential. We call it anamnesis in theology. You will know it very well. It's to, in the present, remember the past, not any past, God's past with us. And in this present, God's future opens up right here. In other words, past, present, and future comes together in this moment. And we're always busy with creating space. Space is not a given. So by letting liturgy with the anamnetic possibility into our domestic spaces, those spaces are transformed into God's space. And we are then invited into those spaces in our domestic spaces. So for us, that was very important, just describing what's going on with regard to bodies in spaces. A second probe was, we call it carnal hermeneutics. We take the term from Richard Carney. He wrote a book together with Triano called Carnal Hermeneutics. It's a philosophical study related to the senses, and they specifically concentrated on touch, the importance of skin. Intrasake last year, the same Richard Carney also wrote a book, a smaller book with the title Touch, emphasizing the importance of the sense of touch, especially during the pandemic. Okay, so carnal hermeneutics tells us that in the morning, say this morning, I was still half asleep when I realized I had to get up. But before I started reflecting on my day, my skin already told me it's autumn. No, sorry, it's spring. It's spring. It's springtime. It's not cold, but maybe take a blazer. In other words, your body knows before you actively reflect on what's going on. So we shouldn't underestimate how our bodies, through our skin, are already interpreting the world, even before we start to actively think and reflect and critically scrutinize and interpret the world in which we live. So, connected to the fact that our bodies are hermeneutic vehicles, the moment that your body is put in a different space, the body functions with regard to interpretation in a different way. And our bodies, I think our bodies were in pain. We didn't realize that because they were in solitary confinement. They were locked in. And that made a huge change. But once again, like with the first probe in the end, we must say liturgy had the potential to lock open locked in bodies. Okay, so that was the second one, the carnal hermeneutics one. The third one, which I call the anthropological one, we basically looked at worship and liturgy as a ritual. And rituals, they've got different dimensions. Rituals do things, okay? And we concentrated on a few of those that became particularly important during lockdown. For example, the dimension of condensation. It means that as soon as you put something very ordinary, okay, within the context of a ritual or liturgy, its meaning symbolically changes. Take a glass of water. It's just water. I'm thirsty, I take a sip. Put it in the liturgy, it becomes the water of the Red Sea. It becomes the water of the Jordan. It becomes the flood. It becomes back. You get the idea. And the same, that became particularly true for us, the aspect of condensation in lockdown, because domestic, everyday elements that we usually overlook actually gained new potential because it was incorporated in a new space, that space of a domestic lockdown liturgy. That's the one. The more obvious ones were connected to, for example, the therapeutic potential, okay, and also the channeling potential of liturgy. So instead of just like reflecting a lightning bolt, okay, liturgy actually captures what we experience and channel those experiences within a liturgy or a ritual in a meaningful way. So it's got great therapeutic potential. And you can imagine a time like we in, but especially we were in under levels 4 and 5, how important these liturgies potentially were also with regard to the pastoral side of theology. And the last one was the one that Johansen here specifically concentrated on, his work in the past on the theological notion of space. He did that again for us in a beautiful way. And he wrote, connected to what the insights we gained from the previous probes, he wrote and he said that we must start to theologically and hermeneutically mentor people, okay, so that we can become more and more aware of the potential of God in the everyday. And I think lockdown liturgies helped us to a large extent. So Peter, in brief, those were the 4 probes that we looked at.
Gus, this is really a fascinating chapter, and I think you opened up a lot of questions that we are really dealing with at the moment. In congregations and communities, we all went through this or still are in this, and you help us to think about it, to make sense. Just in conclusion, 1 or 2 things that you just want to say in conclusion.
Well, I think I can just emphasize again that during the deep lockdown, human bodies, our bodies, were locked into certain spaces. And that was, for a lot of people, very painful. It was bad. But I think to realize anew that what I call the anamnetic potential of liturgy. So locked in spaces were via liturgy, for many people, locked open. Now, of course, we looked at Kieskerk. Not all the churches in South Africa had the potential of those kinds of liturgies, but even just a short message from a minister on a cell phone on a Sunday morning that you receive. I mean, in a symbolic way, it opens up your locked-in space. It locks it open towards God's space. So just to emphasize the importance of that, and then how we are then via that connected to God's reality. Also, with regard to the future, I would like to make 2 comments. On the one hand, I think the lockdown liturgies emphasized again for us the importance of when we work with liturgy, we work with human beings with 5 senses, not only hearing and seeing human beings. And I think we must, going towards the future, not only for online liturgies, but for all liturgies, think again, especially in the Reformed tradition, my own tradition, think again, what do we do also with the other 3 senses? And I want to conclude also that we can once again just appreciate what liturgy meant for people and means for people, okay, in their lives every day going forward, and to be, like one of our professors always used to say, it helps us continuously to look in the right direction.
Gus, we are going to talk a lot in the coming times about bodily and digital presence, yes, the spaces. Thank you for helping us formulating the questions. We're looking forward to the discussion.
Pleasure being here. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much for that. I see Johan is here. I didn't see him earlier, but I see he is here. Johan, anything you'd like to add to this chapter that you and Gus worked on together? Hello, nice to see you.
Hello, Peter. No, not much to add. I think Gus has covered it quite adequately. Perhaps I can just say that writing the chapter was actually, in a certain sense, a liberative experience. You know, lockdown can be evaluated quite negatively, but in terms of the fact that we could rediscover certain basic elements of liturgy, Gus spoke about that at length, like our body, you know, which does not contrast to spirituality, but actually constitutes spirituality. So our skins are sacred, to use the same term. And of course, a notion like space, space is more than just place. So our homes become holy in a certain sense. And so there was a rediscovery which actually was liberative in a certain sense, even though we had very negative experience, some people of the lockdown. But in that sense, like always, when church and theology goes through certain periods of crises, we are actually challenged to rethink and to revisit and to rediscover. And in this sense, we rediscovered the deeper meaning, not only the pragmatic moves that people could make, like modes of maintenance, but rather going deeper into the theological questions about body, about spirituality, about space, about place, about the whole plethora of things that Gus spoke about. So I cannot add much besides saying thank you, Gus, for reminding me what we wrote.
Yes. Peter, when I now had to look at myself and the video, I thought we must remember there's also some trauma in lockdown liturgies, especially for liturgists and preachers who have to look at themselves afterwards. It's a terrible experience, really.
Indeed. Yes, quite so. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next video, which is with Nicholas Mattia. I don't think Nicholas is with us here, so I don't think we'll be able to comment too much on what he has to say afterwards. But perhaps, Gus, if you're still around, we could close off with you at the end. Perhaps you and Johan. And I also would like to say Dr. Peter White also mentioned something in his chapter on this particularly. So maybe Dr. White would like to say something after we watch this particular video. Thank you so much. Silva, you can go with the next video, the interview with Nicholas Mattia.
Okay, just a minute. Our next conversation is with Nicholas Mattia, who did his PhD study with Professor Weppener on mourning in the digital space. When you grieve about lost ones, in the past it was done differently. Nowadays it's more and more it takes place in cyberspace. And Nicholas did some fascinating research on that and wrote an article for our volume, which is wonderful to read. Nicholas, thank you for joining us. And maybe I could ask you for a start just to introduce us to this topic. What motivated you to do this study, and what is it about?
Yes, thank you, Peter. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk about this. So yeah, let's get to why I'm motivated to write about death and dying and grieving. It's a difficult question to answer. I'm not exactly sure where it comes from. I just know that periods of transition are important in life in general. I mean, social structures and society is governed by a lot of these transitions, and certain cultures have different transitions. But I've always been fascinated by these pivotal or liminal instances and pivotal moments in life, and death is one of them. And death is the final frontier. Well, it depends on how you see the frontier, but it could be the final one. and it's always fascinated me, and it's something that's not talked about that much, and I feel it's a very important part to explore. I think perhaps all of us have touched with death, lost loved ones and people we know and friends and family, and I always found it a fascinating area of human expression, and the rawness of it, and the importance of it in continuing living with the loss. And in the context of this article, obviously COVID has introduced a lot of death into our lives. I think it's at least, well, I'm not that old, but at least in my lifetime, this is probably the most I've ever had to think about death and hear about death, in my memory, at least. And I think it's very important that we think about how we engage this, how we understand the different processes and parts of death, dying, and grieving, and especially in the church. The church is a place where people come for healing, to deal with these things. Funeral services are the traditional way of doing that. But as we all know, with COVID and restrictions on physical gatherings and all the difficulties that came with that, made it very difficult to actually engage in this way. And therefore, I think it's a quite an important topic to think about, at least.
In your study, you did your PhD before COVID, and COVID was like it accelerated. As you explained now, what was happening. Maar ek gaan hierdie vraag so 'n bietjie anders net formuleer. Ek gaan net gou weer begin. Yes, Nicolas, as you explained now, you did your study for your PhD before COVID. So digital mourning, or mourning in the digital space, was already there, but now we had to move into that direction. We were forced. What was your findings in your study, and what would you say now during COVID? What did you find? What happens in the digital space when mourning of a lost one moves into the digital space and rituals move into the digital space? What happens?
Yes, thanks. That's a fantastic question. Interestingly enough, for the PhD, grief and rituals and things were already in digital space long ago. I mean, since the internet started, you can go look at some very old cyber cemeteries and things that you can find from as far back as the 90s and 80s already. So it is a fact that humans have already used digital space creatively to kind of build ritual spaces and places for, in the context of our discussion, for mourning and for grieving and for remembering the dead. So in a certain sense, it's nothing new. I think that's also the fantastic part of studying human behavior and how we interact with these things, is that nothing is really new ever. It's just evolutions of behavior we've been exhibiting as far as we can remember. So that's interesting that already existed, and it was prominent. In the article, I also referred to Chester Bennington, which he was the lead vocalist of a I don't know what you call it, a rock or a metal band, depending on where you stand on it, Linkin Park. And I looked at his, let's say, his memorial website in my PhD, and it was already, what happened there is what's happening a little bit more widespread now. And people went there to remember him, to talk about him, to talk to him. There's a lot of interactions with that kind of thing. So it was popular there, and it's usually with deaths of celebrities. You will see that a little bit. But yeah, we've now moved to COVID, where we've lost access to the physical ritual in most parts. I think many of us can attest. There are some funerals where you could only have 30 people or less, even depending on how many staff was on the premises. So that obviously meant some people, even close people, would miss out on the physical funeral because there simply was not enough space due to the restrictions. And these people had to go somewhere to participate in the ritual in the first place and express their own grief. I think that's an important part of death rituals, is the expression of your own grief and your experience of life and death and all the things that comes with that liminal space. And I think we saw this move to digital space a lot more than in the past. So just to take an example, social media is something we use daily. It's become part and parcel of how we live now. And you could see if someone passed away and you would visit that person's Facebook page or Instagram page or TikTok or whatever you wanted to use to have your digital identity, you would see thousands of messages speaking directly to that person, speaking about that person, remembering that person, expressing grief. And this was interesting because it was in a funeral service. Traditionally, you would kind of follow the instructions. It sounds very mechanical if I put it that way, but just to keep it simple. So the ritual has certain movements and you would follow the movements, which is how they work. And it didn't necessarily didn't have a lot of space for individualized expression. You could write a little message, or you could put a flower in some container or whatever the ritual had entailed, but mostly everyone did that, and that was how you participate in that ritual. Now, with the wide openness of the internet and digital technologies, people could really individually express exactly what they felt. And this comes with a lot of pros and cons, obviously, which we won't go into at this moment. But this meant that people, there was no recipe, if I could put it like that. There was no ritual script to tell you this is how you grieve in the online space. And this was very interesting that people, churches were not really on the forefront of this. I think in the COVID context, churches would stream a funeral service, and some of them, as I mentioned in the chapter, would post it online to have a little bit of a longer lifetime, but mostly just stream it. And after that moment has passed, and if you missed the stream, it's gone. I think you could probably request it from the church if they save the file. But after that, people went to the Facebook pages, mostly of the people they are grieving and mourning about, and expressed their grief there. And this is mostly using the tools on Facebook. So Facebook becomes a ritual catalyst in that sense, that you can post photos, you can type a message, you can post a video. And people would do that. They would post videos, photos, remembering the person, talking about the person. And that was on a very individual level. So every person would kind of, sometimes it might have felt like everyone was the guy or the girl's best friend, which is not always the case, and it could make some of the other grieving a little bit more complex. But besides that, it was simply a very creative space, a sandbox, if you will. Where people could create their own rituals, could create their own ways of remembering and thinking about this person. I think that's very important, a phenomenon in society with COVID, and how that challenges our understanding of funeral rituals going forward is, I think, is quite a hefty challenge.
This is very close to us all, to our bodily existence. How do you think of the way forward? If you think of what has happened in the meantime, COVID didn't stop. Is it going to stop? We are in this. Are there new questions that arose for you? Further study maybe in this field? What do you think about it? What is next? What are the questions for us going forward?
Yes, I think, well, like I said, nothing is really new. It's simply evolutions of what we already know. So I think it simply shed the light on different questions for things we've been thinking about for a long time already. I think something like hybrid rituals will become something to think about. I think we tend to see and think in a one space at a time, if I can put it like that. If we attend a physical corporeal opportunity, we think about that simply in terms of our physical bodies. But I think we, as churches and as religious communities, need to think about the different spheres where people interact and live. And it is simply a fact that we, in modern times, or contemporary times, as you'd rather say, we do live at the nexus of the online-offline world. We don't simply exist in the offline world anymore, and we don't simply exist in the online world. Our identities are interwoven into both these spaces. So I think that is one challenge, just thinking about the things going forward, is how do we engage people in both these very important spheres of living. There's strong arguments for the physical because that's what we're used to, and that's what we know, and that's what we kind of harken back to. If you think about especially rituals like communion, people, there's a lot of strong opinions about whether that should ever be online or if that should stay in a physical space. And that just shows the tension created when we have to consider that we don't simply live in one space anymore. We may physically exist in the physical space, but we exist in these different spaces as well. So I think that's one question on the table. And I think along with hybrid liturgies and technology, which is, I mean, there are many other spaces, I guess, we can talk about, but for this context, it's physical and digital space. And digital space it's data. It's at the end of the day, it's computers. So I think a big question for me is how do we as churches and religious communities understand the role of data going forward and informing what we do? Is it okay? I don't have answers to this. This is what I'll be studying going forward. But is it okay to track the participation of your members of the church in what they do? Can you have a camera that takes facial recognition in the church to see which songs people like and don't like in the liturgy? And can you use that data to understand what your congregation, what the kind of spiritualities that they experience? Can that be measured with data? And can you inform your liturgies with this data? And I think that's a super important question coming up in the near future of religious and liturgical and ritual elements, is how do we not only use digital spaces, in the chapter I talk about replication, how do we not only use these spaces to replicate what we already do in the physical space, but how do we really use them to configure new ways of religious ritual and liturgical expression? And I think I don't have the answers for that. I'm very excited to find some, hopefully, in the future. But I think those are two questions that, in my mind at least, that I think is going to be very important going forward.
Nicholas, thank you very much. It is exciting to join you in this conversation.
Thanks, Peter. It was fantastic.
Well, thank you so much to those colleagues for those contributions. Interesting, stimulating as well. Nicholas isn't with us, but because I know he studied with you, so I don't know if you want to add anything. We have a few minutes to go. We're going to take a break at 11 o'clock for comfort break, tea break, whatever, for about 15 minutes. First, before I get to you, I wanted to just say thanks to Ian for posting that Kerkwoorde article on how the pandemic is changing our patterns of our morning patterns, which is actually an interview with Nicholas in the latest Kerkwoorde, I think. But Cas, I wanted to just ask you perhaps your thoughts. You mentioned the whole issue of sacraments, and it's very interesting for me that there were some people who absolutely refused to do sacraments in a virtual space for various reasons, and others who made adaptations. Can you give some thoughts on that? You know, how do we celebrate the sacraments in a virtual space?
Sure, Peter. First of all, if I may, I want to say, commenting on Nicholas' contribution, I love the way in which he didn't work in a either-or paradigm, but he showed us we're in a new place, and we have to creatively and critically think about this new hybrid reality that we're in. When I speak to our students in class, etc., I hear wonderful comments, but also very negative, almost camp formations regarding a yes or a no regarding this issue. And I love the way in which Nicholas approached it as going beyond binary thinking here and realizing we need new ways of approaching this. Also appreciative, but also his last point's very critical. There was, regarding the sacraments, a smaller movement worldwide where people said, in solidarity with people suffering in the world, they will abstain and fast from celebrating the sacraments. Personally, I've got my own opinion on that, and Johan Silje and I just, it will come out any day now. We had a follow-up article in STJ, Stellenbosch Theological Journal, in which we also commented on that. And to our mind, it depends, like theology always does, a lot also, not only on our existing sacramental theology, but on the context in which we are thinking about the sacraments. And our thinking within our context here, I mean, we can take a very strong so-called prophetic stance against any celebration. Our people were, we spoke in the beginning about social drama upon social drama upon social. Our people had a huge need. It was really traumatic. It was a matter of poverty and on top of that pandemic. And our argument went along the lines of, we needed a pastoral mode now with regard to, and being pastoral is being prophetic now. And that will include a celebration of the sacraments. Now that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the moment our liturgical theology obviously kicked in very strongly during the pandemic. And those arguments, the negative argument pertaining to the celebration of communion, the Eucharist, Lord's Supper, usually came from older, higher liturgical traditions. It was interesting for me like that in the Reformed traditions and other more charismatic traditions, it wasn't really a big issue. However, what was very interesting for me in South Africa, I had to look at quite a number of websites of Roman Catholic churches. They did celebrate forms of online sacraments. So they actually did do it. And one needs empirical work and focus groups and interviews with the people to ask why. But I think it's because they also understand pastoral to be prophetic and prophetic to be pastoral, and that you cannot separate them. Just some thoughts.
Very good. Thank you so much. I wanted to comment. Dr. Peter White mentioned in his chapter the church as a more like a living system, like an organism, a living organism. I'm not sure if Dr. White is still with us. He was here earlier. I didn't see if he's still here. But if you are here, Dr. White, if you want to comment on that, and if he's not here, just for us to reflect, I think, as we go into the break, on if we see the church as a living organism and not as some sort of organization, this whole idea of which I think COVID has really kind of helped us to see in a way that we perhaps didn't see it before. It's an interconnected organism that binds people to one another, and that's perhaps one of the great learnings out of COVID, the value, in other words, of connection, and how we prioritize that and retain that in this. I don't like to speak of a post-COVID world because I think we'll be in the COVID reality for some while, but how we retain that, as we learn to live with this pandemic and move forward on it. And perhaps we could end with that. Cas, if you've got some thoughts.
Yes, I'm careful looking to the future, but I think what a lot of the chapters showed us, and that Peter also reflected on Peter, that COVID to a large extent was a mirror. It showed us what we've got. And when it comes to connections, I just briefly want to mention it. We had a huge research project on which we published a book called Bonding in Worship. We looked for several years at African initiated churches and the role of their worship practices. And it came out that bonding was the strongest thing. We linked it to social capital formation. And it came out that the kind of social capital that's generated in congregations via worship practices is of a different quality to the kind of bonding that's generated in other organizations. And for me, that whole project just flagged actually the aspect that you just mentioned, the importance of this. Whereas we are now on a point where we realize we really need webinars like this one, where we can critically think of how we cannot lose what we've already got. Okay, so we're already losing some of it, and how we can go in a meaningful way within the sphere of the fourth industrial revolution forward. And maybe even if we listen to people like Nicholas earlier on, to embrace the fourth industrial revolution and see how we can enhance this without leaving certain communities with not enough data and not good connectivity, etc., behind. So there are creative potential, but we must remain very, very critical about all of this.
Gus, thank you so much to you and Johan and all the others for your contributions. This has been a fascinating discussion, I think, and again teased out this issue for us to think about and to kind of apply ourselves to as we move forward. And thank you so much for your contribution, both in terms of the book and your contribution today. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
friends. We'll break now for 15 minutes. We'll be back at 11:15, where Peter will be picking up an interview, talking to the Dean and introducing the next section. So we are off now, and we'll be back at 11:15. Thank you so much.
Peter, just before we leave, on your program, you've got it 11:30, and the Dean in the meantime contacted me to ask what time he's on, and I told him it's 11:35. So we must just make sure that we don't mix it up now. According to your program, you said the tea break will be up to 11:30. I'm not sure if you're still with me, if you're still listening.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
So I'm trying to say, according to your program, the newest one I got, it's only 11:15 at tea break up till 11:30, and yes. The video with Reggie will be 11:35 because he's in another meeting and he asked me when he will be on, and he's the next person that's on. So maybe we can make a bit longer break now, but if we're going to start before that, Reggie won't be available, and that's going to be a problem.
No, thanks, Ian. Thanks for that. That's very helpful. I think what we'll do is I think we'll start at 11:15 and then we'll go straight into the video. Peter can do a little intro into the video, and then we'll pick up the discussion with Reggie after that, which should be at around 11:30 or so.
Great. Okay. I think that's fine.
So we'll break now, and we'll be back at 11:15, and then we'll go straight in. Peter can do a little intro, and we'll go straight into the video, and then he can do the discussion with Reggie after the video at about 11:30. Thank you for that.
I got that, Peter and Ian. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, colleagues. All right, friends and colleagues, we're back, I think, after a short break, and ready for our third session, which is participation in networks. And I'm going to hand over to Peter van der Walt. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. While we are still waiting for Professor Nel, I just want to pick up where we concluded in our previous session. Peter, you referred to the article of Dr. Peter White, who speaks of the church as an organization, as an organism, not as much an organization, but an organism. And you talked about the interconnectedness, and Cas also picked up on that and talked about bonding. So I really find the article of Professor Reginel very enriching. It's in the middle of the book, and it's really wonderful to read and touching, and I think a very, very important article. He tells the story that's not in the video, so I will just tell it very quickly. He tells the story that he wrote of Facebook CEO Sheryl Sandberg, who in 2017 lost her husband to a sudden death, and she shared her experiences of how she grappled with her own trauma during that, and she calls it a seismic event that shakes our belief in a just world, robbing us of a sense that life is controllable, predictable, and meaningful. And he compared the trauma that we have often referred to, trauma upon trauma upon trauma. He compares that, he finds, in her words, something articulated about that experience of trauma. And she says, in the depths of acute grief, I didn't think I would be capable of growing stronger. But as excruciating days turned into weeks and then months, I realized that I could imagine because I was living it. I had gained strength just by surviving. In the words of an old adage, how do you pronounce that? Let me fall if I must fall. The one I become will catch me. Let me fall if I must fall. The one I become will catch me. And then he draws on that and talk of bouncing forward. I remember in the Dean's newsletters, weekly newsletters, he always also reminded us throughout the time that we can bounce forward. But that can only happen if we are confronted by our wounds, if we look at, also falling backwards and see the trauma that we experience in the country, that is in the country before, that was there before COVID, when we face that, and then if we are willing to own up to the impotence of our eloquence as middle-class ministers and the impotence of our models to bring about the fundamental structural transformation that is necessary in our country. So therefore, he writes about deep work. We have to do deep missional work. We cannot just continue living and being church as we are, digging deep, staying in the depths of acute grief, even to the point of falling, allows for the possibility of finding spiritual growth, healing, and connection. And from this deeper, sacred space, emerge transformation as growth and emerge transformation as growth and emerge pointers for a new future, bouncing forward. So that's just a little bit of background for Professor Nel's article. His last sentence, or in conclusion, is really, it stays with you. for a long time, perhaps this moment can be a call for us to stop working on our neat models and programs, and rather to simply play along with God, allowing our bodies to sense the pulse of the Spirit and move along, bouncing backward, feeling deep, and from here, bouncing forward. Let us have a look at the video, and then we can discuss this very important article.
Professor Reggie Nell wrote an article in this volume about the move from missional theology to really deep work. Reggie, it's a pleasure talking to you. COVID really challenged us to accelerate in this move towards deep work, towards a deeper critical understanding of what we are doing when we are doing church. Maybe if you give us a short overview of the article, that would be very helpful.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you also for the conversation, because I wanted the article to stir conversation, and this is what it's all about. Initially, my research, my work focused on missional ecclesiology as a theologist, and specifically coming from the history of what we used to be called the mission church, Zendenkerk and the Zendenkerk, to ask the question, how have the missionary ecclesiologies that we've inherited, how did it shape our practices? And trying to discern, that's the word we also use in the conversation, African missional ecclesiology. And then just briefly, I packed it out in terms of church as a social network, church as a missional or what I call a mobile community, church as dancing in the spirit. But like you say, during COVID, we were challenged to dig deeper. And for me, it was a personal experience, perhaps we can talk about that, that challenged me to go beyond just these words. On the one hand, I think we, because of the pandemic and the lockdown regulations, had to shift to social network. We then had to shift to become a mobile community, or to think of church, as a family, as a home, having communion in the house or sharing the bread and the wine with the family. But the challenge is it only programmatic? Is the only programs that we are changing? And how are we challenged to go deeper, to really discern what is the Spirit of God really saying to us in this time? So that was, in essence, the overview of the article. It was not just writing it. For me, it was really a journey of discerning and asking God, what are you telling us in this time?
I really experienced this when I read your article. That it was personal for me as well. Reading the article, just knowing that COVID-19, it stopped us in our tracks. It forced us to discern deeper. I read the article while the unrest was going on as well, in that week of unrest. So it was a deep personal thing about being church in this country with our history. And if you want to say something more about the personal side, what it personally meant to you while you wrote it, that would be wonderful to hear, Reggie.
Yes, no, thank you for that, and also for sharing how you experience it. For me, and I affirm, we are living in a very unequal society. I mean, it's been said many times, but it affected people differently. And what you refer to in terms of the July disruptions, in a sense, also again echoes and affirms the desperation of people. But the question and the challenge is, do we just respond again by putting new measures in place without asking the deeper questions? And my personal journey with COVID, having been infected myself, having had to go through that period of quarantine, but also struggling, because in that moment you ask a lot of questions about life, about death, about your core, your flaws, but also why is God giving you another opportunity? But then also I lost my mother during that time, also because of COVID. And then you have to dig deeper. And in the one section of the article, I referred to a book I read about trauma and how we deal with grief. It's about not just bouncing back to where we were, but in a sense bouncing forward also. But to be able to bounce forward, to grow out of trauma, you need to also ask questions about where do I come from? Where am I now? And then also theologically, what is God doing in this? So part of one of the outcomes which I thought is important in terms of also personally my spiritual journey for us as a church community, but also as theologians, is to grapple with spirituality, grapple with contemplation, contemplative practices, and its relation to research. So it's not just a cognitive exercise, it's also about dealing with the deeper layers of grappling with our spirituality, grappling with God at work through His Holy Spirit. And I think that's for me one of the key outcomes of this process. But like I say, a process because we're not done yet. It's part of a journey. I refer to the rituals, I refer to some of the practices that might help us to go deeper.
And this all connects very well to the rest of the volume of the work that other colleagues have done, of your colleagues at PTM. Reggie, I sense this wonderful move that COVID has helped us with from mere programs in churches, in congregations, towards joining, participating in social networks. And if there's a phrase that really stuck with me from your article, it's this one: go deeper than the soup kitchens. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about that move that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Of course, I want to start by affirming the wonderful work that has been done through the soup kitchens and through many congregations, feeding the vulnerable communities. And I mean, many of us participated in that some way or the other. But we have to go deeper. And we have to also ask the deeper question: what is behind the lines of people who are lining up desperate, people in our society? Have we failed also as policymakers? Have we failed as church to keep policymakers accountable? But then also, what is it that we can also learn from the poor, from people who are vulnerable? How do they challenge us in terms of our spirituality? So it was not just about us having something to give, but it's also about us receiving and being challenged towards a deeper transformation. And that is still, I mean, I'm not saying we have, that we have completed that, it's a done deal. That is an ongoing journey. The danger now, I think the danger now is that we want to return to normal as soon as possible and to go back to our programs. And I think that's going to be sad. It's going to be a missed opportunity and a missed, perhaps, move of God, despite the challenges. And if we dig deeper, then we can talk about the reasons why we had this pandemic, the reasons behind the COVID situation. But we also need to move on and ask the question. It's a reality now. How is it challenging us towards a deeper transformation, towards creating a new world, a better world, a more habitable world, oikos, a home, where all people feel that they are treasured and that they are safe.
Reggie, thank you so much. May this article also help to deepen the conversation about the deep work that needs to be done. Thank you so much.
That's our prayer. Thank you.
Hi, Reggie, Professor Nell. We are glad that you could make it. We watched the video now, and yeah, it feels like yesterday that we had that discussion. In the meantime, a lot has happened. Maybe some further comments from your side before we take some questions and comments.
You muted, Reggie.
Thank you, Ian. I haven't said anything. I thank you, Ian, for the invitation to be part of this project, and Peter, and also for this conversation. Of course, Peter, the challenge now is we are returning to face-to-face. We are returning to, in terms of our churches, also to, in a sense, continue the work. But there is, there is a concern in my heart, and we can see it with the bigger challenges, the bigger picture, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, that in a sense we are returning to the old aggression, even microaggressions, but also macroaggressions. We're returning to the old, in English, Afrikaans, loopgrawe. It's painful that we are at a place where we ask the question, haven't we learned anything? Haven't we allowed God also to take us deeper, to affirm our deeper connections with each other, even though we might be different with, I think in terms of church, I hold my heart in my hands that we want to return to a pre-COVID phase, and that's why the challenge of spirituality, of asking deep questions. God, where did you lead us? Why this? But how do we grow out of this? Not bouncing back, but how do we bounce forward? What have we learned from this trauma that we are in? That's my hope. That's my humble hope, and also hopefully a resilient hope that we could move to that space in terms of discerning what is God teaching us as His church.
Thank you very much, Reggie. I was really struck by the quote that you had in the middle of the article. You say the question is, are we as middle-class ministers and theologians today, that was the person that you were quoting, asked, willing to own up to perhaps the impotence of our eloquence and our models in bringing about fundamental structural transformation? So you said we do not need to rely on our analytical tools. That's what we normally do. We do more analysis, but then we are on a safe and unaffected social distance. But we have to go deep. So it's really significant, the connection that you make, the dots that you connect between this deep work and spirituality.
Yeah.
So that was something that I found very striking in your article. But let us open up for some questions, comments. You are very welcome to participate. You can just come in, maybe pop a message, or just put up your hand. and you are welcome to participate.
I wonder, Peter, while colleagues are gathering their thoughts, or perhaps all the questions have been answered, maybe just a second comment. I am also cautious. We need the analytical tools, but we must remind ourselves constantly that these are tools. These are human-made tools with all the inadequacies and the limitations that goes along with that. It often says something about ourselves, and we constantly need to be self-critical. That's the one comment. And when we relate this to our relationship with God, the whole notion of contemplation towards formation, then we need to constantly remind ourselves that our tools are needed. It is limited, but ultimately we want these to also serve our spiritual formation, deeper spiritual formation.
Thanks for that. So once again, it's not a or.
It's not
a binary thing, but it's the head, the mind, and the heart together. Yes. Yep. Thank you for that, Reggie. Any other comments or questions? You are very welcome.
It seems not.
Don't see any hands now, Reggie, but we want to thank you for this article. I hope that everybody gets the chance to read it, and I think it's an article that you can read more than once. It's very enriching and important, significant for a time like this, and especially I think for now as well, when we are moving out of the pandemic. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to the colleagues. Good to see you all.
Thank you. Okay. We are going to move directly to the new video. This is quite a long video. Christo Tesnar had a lot to say, and very intriguing things that he puts on the table concerning our pastoral work. It was also very prominent in the time. How do we do our pastoral work in congregations in a time of lockdown? And what did we learn from this? What did we see? What did we? What about the questions that arose from it? And Christo also wrote a very neat article that is very helpful. But let us go straight to the video, and then we can have questions after that.
Professor Christo Tesnar, lecturer in pastoral care. Christo, it's very nice to talk to you about the impact of COVID on pastoral care in congregations. It was tremendous. How do you see that impact?
It's amazing how it just exposed our vulnerability to many things that happens around us. And what is also interesting is sometimes, you know, crisis comes and it's an acute reality, and we look at it and then we think, well, let's see if it will pass by quite soon. And then we realize this is not an acute crisis. It's actually much more of a chronic crisis, sort of a longer term reality. It's not a short impact, but a much more latent process. And I think, you know, for us as pastoral caregivers, we are caught off guard in many ways. Now, the question is, who's pastoral caregivers? I think it's always important that we as ministers or pastors in the congregation or those members of our congregations who specifically focus on caring for the other could be classified as pastoral caregivers. And I think for what we learned from this impact is that it actually had an impact on all of us. You can never say it never really touched you or it never really had an impact on you, because people around us passed away, people had COVID, people lost their jobs. So it's been a quite tremendous reality of what this implies, but also for the church. We are, suddenly we were caught in a position of uncertainty, because everything that was so certain for so many years and decades suddenly changed from a ministry of presence to an online reality where we are not able to meet the other physically, and we are to trust ourselves to use that as a communication medium in a space where we're not sure how that will develop. But also, it also had an impact on the individual, us as pastoral caregivers, that we should not miss. Pastoral caregivers are always those people who stick to the end, care to the end, are so focused on the other that we sometimes lose our ability to care for ourselves. And this is not something new. We saw that in many years ago, 100 years ago, during the big flu epidemic. We saw it in the First World War and the Second World War, where pastoral caregivers were so true to their calling that they continued to persevere, even if it cost their lives. So somehow it's normal for pastoral caregivers to struggle with their calling and their role during a time of crisis, and in this case, much more a long-term reality. Why is it so important? And what I learned from this engagement was that we all use the word trauma so easy. It's not trauma in that sense. Trauma is not the crisis in itself. It is the impact of the crisis on us as human beings, on our society, on who we are. And we've realized that this impact has really somehow had a much deeper impact than we thought. It actually caught us off guard. It exposed our theology in many ways. That's our comfort zone, our theology and our practice. And that is really somehow exposed. It's also exposed the realities of our society, the injustices in our society, the injustices in terms of where people live, what they experience, because this really had an impact that cut like a knife through butter through our whole system. And unfortunately, not having congregants in church services had a financial impact for so many congregations. And caregivers had to cope with that reality. But trauma does not only have an effect on your emotions. Of course, it does open up a lot of emotional reactions, but it does affect on your whole body. Your whole body is affected by trauma. And for us as pastoral caregivers, we neglect that aspect. We keep on doing what we do well, and we struggle with, are we doing well enough in a space that's online or in a space that is so complex? Do we care enough? Is our theology good enough that we sometimes, with the pressure, take shortcuts just to try and cope? We sometimes, neglect our families just to cope for the congregants because they pay our salaries. We sometimes, get so caught up in the fact that we are not able to care physically, that we are caught up in this space of, what's needed of me. I need to give answers. I need to give solutions. I need to, develop some kind of almost a cheap theology just to be able to give answers to people so that they still feel that I can still feel I'm a good enough pastoral caregiver. I'm still a good enough minister, and that causes a lot of tension in our system. And I think that's the part I would like to just open up by saying, we as pastoral caregivers I've learned in this process, we'll need to learn what it means to be honest to ourselves, to our congregants, to our family members. So those are the few aspects. I hope that makes some sense.
Thank you, Christo. This helps us to understand this tremendous pressure that was put on pastoral caregivers in so many different ways. Before COVID started, you did a lot of research on the approach to pastoral care, and your emphasis is less on individualistic, face-to-face contact and pastoral care, and more on interconnectedness, the network society that we live in, the systems that people live in, and so forth. Could you maybe say something about the advantages that you think this approach has for us in a time like this? I've read about that in your chapter. I would like you to say a bit more about that, please.
Thanks, Peter. I think this is something that we are all still in the process of developing, because, you know, I'm glad to use the word approach, not the word model, because the model sometimes has this ability to say, you know, this is something that needs to fit in all situations. But this is really an approach. And the focus of the approach is on dialogue, which I think is incredibly important. Because if there's real dialogue, there's an encounter. And if there's an encounter, there's trust. And if there is trust, there's a meeting. And if there's a meeting, healing can take place. But that has a lot to do with how I see the other person or the other persons that I'm involved with. If I objectify them, or I objectify the family or the church or the community, then there can be no dialogue. Then all the pressure is on me to create something and to do something, but the responsibility in that process is not shared. The second aspect of that approach is on intergenerationality. Now, what is that? That is that we should always remember that our past and our present and our future are interconnected. So we actually carry a lot from the past in the present, but we also carry a lot from the present in the way we operate. But we also can make a decision, what do we pass on to the next generation? So in the sense, when COVID happens, it exposes also our deepest connectedness. So if we carry things that's not been dealt with from previous generation, it will for sure have an effect on this generation, and it will for sure have an effect on what we do with it in terms of the future generation. So there's always this interconnectedness from generations. And then pastoral, of course, this is our core being. We are embedded as followers of Christ to care for the other. And I use the word process because it is still ongoing. It will change as time goes by, and we are responsible to make sure it continues to change, so that we find the best applicable way that we can deal with in our society today. But I think what's also important with this approach is that somehow we thought in the past that a good pastoral counselor is somebody that meets with somebody else, or with a family, or with a community, physically in the present. I as a person, have good skills, and I can use that skills to assist this person, these people. And I need to help them from a dysfunctional position to develop to a functional position. That's my role. And that makes me a good pastoral caregiver. People are happy because I'm the minister. I play my role as they expected. That's expected of me. But I've realized that COVID helped us to understand that not all good meetings, encounters, pastoral sessions are necessary good meeting spaces where dialogue takes place, where we do not objectify the other, where we actually meet in a space of being interconnected to each other. God didn't create us as lone beings. If He did that, we would have all been created on the island. We are connected. And what we've learned is that real constructive pastoral care engagements should be built on dialogue, on trust, and that can happen any place. To develop good encounters where healing can take place is not something that I, as pastor or pastoral caregiver, need to construct. It happens in that meeting. It happens in that space. And for too long, we've been in the space where we thought we need to give the energy, we need to provide the tools and the answers. So that I think is important. Secondly, I think what I've also realized, as I said that earlier, is that our theology has been challenged. And again, sometimes our theology is limited in the sense that we always say, well, a good theologian needs to create hope, and bring hope to people, assist people, care for them, etc. And take them from a dysfunctional space to a functional space. But a good theologian is actually somebody that has the ability to practice, develop, understand, interpret the scripture, theology, in a space of discomfort. And I think that's critical that we learned from the virus, the corona reality, where everything was astray. Nothing was certain. We were in uncharted territory. We had to become technical geniuses overnight to, in a sense, just have some kind of ministry. But in that reality, in that uncomfortable space, there we need to be good theologians. And I think making peace with the reality that good theologians will always need to practice in uncomfortable spaces. This approach also helps us to understand that we don't have to carry the load on our own. That's why I like the word that you were using, networking. There are many other caregivers, professional people who are in our congregations, who are brilliant caregivers. They do it in their jobs because they are church members. They share our responsibility. We don't have to constantly put all that pressure on ourselves to become miracle workers in times of difficulties or uncomfort. Our biggest, I think, attitude needs to be that we need to be good to the strangers and remember that we are also a stranger. We need to care for ourselves, and we need to make sure that we are able to care for others, but to share the responsibility to assist people in need.
Christo, this approach that you described, it makes such a lot of sense. You use the phrase practice in the discomfort. Maybe just in short, a few hints for us, practices that we can follow that you have discovered during COVID that works.
Well, thank you, Peter. I think it's always dangerous to give a few short-term answers to your question, but I think it is important that caregivers would need to learn that they are firstly responsible for themselves. I think it's important that we need to take care of ourselves, and in order to do that, we must make sure that we know where our boundaries are. If we exceed our boundaries and we take too much load on ourselves, we will not be in good spaces to help other people. I think it's incredibly important that we should learn to self-delineate, in this sense, to make good choices, to set our boundaries, to know when we need energy again to be able to assist other people. It's not that we're not doing our job or that we are irresponsible, but that will help us to be fresh and to have time to engage with the other in a responsible way. So I think that's important. But it's also important that we should make sure that we are free to live a life that is true to our calling. All of us are called, not only you as a pastoral caregiver. We are all called, and we all have a responsibility. And to be able to move with other people and to have relationships with them and to build trust and to create meetings and encounters is part of everybody's responsibility and not only our own. I think that's important. And to do that, we have to learn to be honest as caregivers, to be really honest, not only to the congregation, but to ourselves, to our family members, because if things are difficult at home, we're under pressure. If the congregation struggle with their finances and they are not able to pay me, I'm under pressure. If they have needs, I'm under pressure. I need to provide care. I need to constantly be there. But that will only end up in a reality of burnout. We are not able to do that. So in that sense, we need time. We need time to recover, but we also need time to be theologians. If we are part of a marathon and not a 100-meter sprint, as we've learned from this COVID reality, our theology needs to constantly develop. We need to learn again to read the Bible. We cannot work without the Bible. We cannot work without good theology. We have to learn and read systematic theology again to make sure we understand what concepts are about. Concepts like hope, like love, like perseverance. Those are big questions. Those are big issues. They are not shortcuts we can just use to try and make other people feel better. We need to really engage deeply with it. I think a caregiver in a vulnerable space of where challenges are, where we are exposed, uncomfortable space, we need deep theology to help us to cope there, and not a cheap a theology that gives answers to difficult questions. I think that's incredibly important. And our ability to understand that trust is something that we build over time. It's not a once-off conversation. So when we engage with the other, make sure that we create trust. And remember, our congregants are not our friends in that sense. We are still the pastor. We have a responsibility because we lead a congregation. So there is, in that sense, it's an important reality that we have a responsibility in that sense to make sure that we develop our theology constantly. And to do that is not an easy reality, and to be a good hermeneutist in this regard is difficult. And then lastly, perhaps, Peter, if you will bear with me, I think we should make peace with being a theologian in the space of this conflict. I think pastoral caregivers should understand that is our niche. That is what we should always remember, that discomfort is a part of who we are. That's our operating space. And if we are able to operate in that space, I think we have a contribution.
Maybe COVID has helped us in the sense to become more true to what we are called for.
Yeah.
Not separate theology or being theologian and pastoral caregiver.
Yeah.
And no shortcuts.
Absolutely.
Christo, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. We look forward to the discussion.
We say thank you to Professor Tesnar. Thank you, Christo. I'm not sure, Ian, if Christo is present. I don't think so.
Hello, Peter. Yes, I am here.
You are, yeah.
Sorry.
Good morning, Christo. Would you at this stage like to add something? A few months have gone by since we had that chat. If you want to add something, you are very welcome, and then we can open up the floor for questions or comments.
Thank you, Peter. Let me just apologize for the long video. That wasn't my intention to keep you busy for so long.
You can blame the interviewer.
No, colleagues, I think, just to say a few things again about the, we refer to a role to develop an approach rather than a model, because I think a model, as I said in the interview, is something that somehow do not help us because the context changes constantly. But I want to add the word attitude with the word approach. To really have a pastoral attitude, an attitude of meeting the other, and not to be arrogant in difficult times. Sometimes we want to, as I said, too easy, too quickly provide an answer. And in that sense, we struggle with our own complexities because we think we need to owe other people answers. But actually, we don't need, and we don't have to answer people, who ask difficult questions in difficult times. But we have to journey with them and always allow us to remember that our calling is that we are dependent on God who assists us in this time of need. And then just again to say that we will not see the end of the impact of COVID in this generation. And therefore the emphasis is on us to deal with the impact now, as soon as possible, if I can use this word, and not hide the impact or